When the weather turns severe, media has to be ready to go. We'll look at why storm coverage is so important.
When tragedy strikes, it often becomes news. But emotions change in a newsroom when one of your own becomes a victim. We'll see how one news staff has dealt with the unexpected.
And when violence becomes a national news story, who's quicker to rush to judgment, the media or the audience? That's our focus on this edition of News Classroom. Hello, I'm Steve Bowers.
And I'm Steve Beverly. For years, market research has told us a consistent story that in many cities, people choose to follow the TV news channel that offers what they believe provides the best local weather coverage. And that is definitely true, particularly in the case of severe weather, whether it's tornadoes, hurricanes, or snow and ice. The folks at home expect the meteorologist to get it right.
And, of course, we've got another major update for you on this upcoming crippling winter storm, so let's get right into it. Starting off with the European model, which has been the MVP for this storm.
We're taking a look at our XRAD radar system, and I can tell you, as the day progresses, this is going to look a lot different.
Even though it happened 41 years ago, the blizzard of 1978 is a weather event no one who lived through it will forget it soon.
And tomorrow is the anniversary of Columbus's biggest snowstorm ever recorded.
Waking up to cold temperatures this morning, and we are finally starting to see some relief a bit. We're in the 40s right now. We're at 43 degrees.
There are multiple scenarios that could play out, and really from north to south, I think we're going to see all of this to some degree.
Like yesterday, viewers were told, yeah, a storm was coming, but the extreme conditions took most by surprise. Two storms merged.
Now that's just a sample of what we saw in late January as the entire nation, it seemed to be, was being blanketed by a major snow and ice storm. And of course, places in the deep south, it's unprecedented, and because they can't afford a lot of the snowplow equipment, then obviously you have a situation where they are literally shut down in many cities. My colleague Steve Bowers has been on multiple sides of covering severe weather. First as a longtime member of the media, and currently Steve is the communications director for Jackson Energy Authority in West Tennessee. And when electricity potentially is in jeopardy, and for those of you at home, I know exactly how that feels, particularly when the weather is dipping down into unprecedented low temperatures, then Steve is the one that has to provide the most important and accurate and up-to-date information for the community in which he serves. So, Steve, let's start this from the media perspective first. Right. You've been on that side.
Right.
What do people expect when severe weather is striking if you're the man behind the mic or in front of the camera?
Steve, they're looking for current and accurate information, and it's a before, during, and after scenario. They're looking for an accurate forecast so they can make plans or adjustments. Then during the situation, whatever it is, if it's ice or it's a tornado or a hurricane, whatever, however long it goes on, what's happening now and what's the current status. And then, of course, then there's a post reporting on what has happened to us and where do we go from here, what efforts are underway, what initiatives are underway. So it's a prolonged story. It may be shortened with tornadoes. It may be compressed like a drag race compared to a 500-mile NASCAR run. But it's all the same information that people are looking for. And it needs to be on point and it needs to be accurate. And then also, I think, Steve, the key thing with the accuracy is there continued danger for other people in other areas.
Steve is a former anchor on News Talk Radio. When dangerous weather develops, how does that affect the volume of calls that you get into the newsroom from people who are wanting information and they want it now?
Well, the calls go up dramatically, especially in the early days of talk radio when the telephone was your communication source before we had text lines and other things that you have now. And the information, varied. Steve, it's a fascinating thing as to what's happening. People that are going through this, that are suffering from this, there's an intensity level for them. Sometimes they are looking for specific information, or hey, I'm in my home, I can't get out. If people have got chainsaws, whatever, that can help me. I mean, it can get very personal. I do remember when we had the tornadoes in 1999 in Jackson, which was our first experience with significant tornado damage in several years, that on the second day, about halfway through the second day, somebody called and said, hey, are you guys going to talk about anything else? And then I realized the situation in South Jackson was totally different than the situation in North Jackson. In North Jackson, the power outages had been limited. Everything was back to normal. Street lights were on, traffic lights were working, and life had resumed. And I'm going through the drive-through, and I'm sick and tired of hearing about all this stuff. Where on the South side, you had people that were just beginning to deal with funerals, assessing the losses in property and everything else. And for them, it was going to be a prolonged story. And so it's really interesting where the audience can be during all of these times as well.
Now, as a spokesman for a public utility with thousands of customers, what is priority one when it comes to information from that standpoint during a weather crisis?
The outage situations, especially for electric customers. Where is the power out? How long is it going to be out? What are the restoration prospects? And Steve, in 1994, we had a significant ice storm here. It took over 2 weeks to get power back, even inside the city. And that's a totally different situation than rural co-ops were facing, where there could be miles between houses. But even with the Jackson Energy Authority, or the Jackson Utility Division as it was then, it was a significant crushing of the entire system. Poles were down, trees were down, limbs were continuing to fall. Guys would go out and repair lines, get things set up, and here comes another tree limb. I mean, it was just a challenging situation all around. And interestingly enough, for customers, I think once the realization of how extensive the damage is, people do get more patient in some ways. It's understanding that everybody's in the same circumstance, and the efforts being made to get power back. Of course, electric grids are different, Steve, and sometimes the people across the street from you may have power and you may not. And they may have power now and you may not get it for 2 or 3 more days, depending on how that grid is laid out and how that electricity service is being distributed. And so there are still challenges.
To wind this up, Steve, social media, I have a good friend who has oftentimes said, brings out the sore heads in the audience. And it's true. And before this recent winter storm in late January, I happened to see several threads on Facebook of people who were saying that the reporters and the meteorologists were all blowing this thing out of proportion. It was not going to be anything because they wanted to get clickbaits. And, that's always, you've got a percentage of the audience who they're going to look at it from that perspective. What do you say to people who say that you're just overblowing everything and they're so skeptical during a weather emergency?
I think it depends on the experience of the people. If you've been through these kind of storms or outages or whatever, if you've lost family members in those kind of situations, you may be hypersensitive to this. If a thunderstorm is coming, you want to know all the details about it. Other people are going to blow it off and not worry about it at all. And so the audience range is different. And then there's some people, our county mayor recently said, citizens against virtually everything, the cavemen. And I thought, well, there's some people that are just unhappy about things, and they're not going to be happy.
Well, Steve, thanks so much for your personal perspective from both sides, of both an information officer and as a former member of the media. But when we come back, does the media or the audience rush to judgment when violence becomes a story? We'll talk to a news professional who has an interesting take next on News Classroom. When protests turn to the streets, they can turn violent. Few have struck a chord in broadcast media as the recent incidents in Minneapolis, a battle between picketers and ICE agents. In any situation of this nature, social media has expedited a rush to judgment as to who is right and who's wrong. But is it just social media? This week, a professor and media analyst examines why we are often so quick to pick sides. An interesting piece was written on Substack by a gentleman who's a good friend of mine. We go back a long way, and he is now Associate Dean of the School of Communication at North Greenville University in Greenville, South Carolina. Randall King joins us, and his column was called The Conclusion Illusion. Randall, I'm glad to have you with us here because I was fascinated by your take on all of this. This is, again, what happened in Minneapolis. You also made reference to the Rodney King situation many, many years ago, but it's one that still, for people who lived through that, it was very, very visible and very much in mind. Why do we have what appears to be a rush to judgment at times with portions of the media as well as the audience?
Well, what I tried to say in the piece, even though it's the conclusion illusion, I think it is a human instinct. It is natural to drive by a car accident and say, well, what happened and who's to blame? So we have a natural human instinct to immediately try to figure it out. We want to know where to point the finger. And to some extent, the need for conclusion, I think, is just to have closure. And that is to be expected, but I think to some extent for very troubling incidents like the one in Minneapolis, we need to suspend that instinct because we don't need to easily let it go. We need to recognize troubling situations are troubling and we need to wrestle with it. I think the instinct today, which is normal and human, but it is exacerbated by our media, particular social media, is that we want to get closure so we can move on. You know, if I can put this incident in this box and it doesn't cause me any more tension that it might, if I can put it in black or white, good or bad boxes, then I can move on with my life. And unfortunately, I think that's true of everything on the national stage, is that we want to make a judgment so we can move on. And that's maybe not what we're supposed to do or should do in many cases.
Let's look at it from a perspective that you personally experienced. Randall was a reporter for a number of years, and in his early career in Florence, South Carolina, near Myrtle Beach. And you dealt with a story involving deadly force that involved a law enforcement officer. How different was that from what we've just seen in Minneapolis, and what were the different kinds of emotions that resulted from that?
Well, Steve, you and I both were reporters back in the day, you a little bit further back than me. But I think every one of us has gone through something like this. I know you were a news director. You probably had some officer-involved shootings, some protest, some kind of incident that you had to deal with, if not as the reporter on the street, or the one supervising them. This is different, obviously, from that, in that we have video, we have social media, and we have 24-hour cable news. And what I do try to unpack in that piece is, here's the lessons learned from my situation in 1985. Here's what's different. But maybe without being naive, we need to get back to some of those things that were common, perhaps in 1985, that aren't as common now. And among them, the key thing, and so the viewers who don't read this, so they know that the shorthand in was an officer involved shooting a white officer, African-American suspect, confrontation incident in the evening. All we knew was that the police were suspending this officer, which is routine, is not an admission of guilt. And I was just the one in the newsroom that they said, no one else is here, go cover this. And then I don't even think I knew when I headed out of the TV station what the story was. We didn't even have an inkling of that, because I think the incident happened at 4 a.m. or something like that. But what immediately happened was the police chief said, this officer, this happened, and this matter is under investigation, and we will say no more. And I don't know what your experience, Steve, is with that, but that was common with law enforcement and any kind of troubling situation. It was pretty much the boilerplate for officer involved shootings.
But Randall, you point out some things, and I'll mention Randall King's material is on Substack, and it is called Turn It Off, which is a very interesting title, and I think it'll get your attention very quickly. Very briefly, let's run down 4 things that you say during the course of your commentary on this that I think really hits home with this. First off, a message to journalists to quell the commentary. How do you see that?
Well, since Rodney King, but really since 24-hour cable news, it is very, very easy, and you've been in breaking coverage, and I have as well, when you never take a break, and especially something that's a shooting or something like that, you constantly hear the live anchors say, we don't want to speculate, but... And maybe they don't, but they bring in someone, or they start bringing in experts, or they start bringing in the public. And it turns from this to that. And before you know it, by day 2, by day 3, we are no longer in the realm of let's not speculate. We are in the realm of conclusions. And then 24-hour news media being what they are, and I your audience is probably all over the map. I don't blame this on Fox News. I just think Fox News did it better than any of the others. And that is turning from reporting to opinion. But the people on these channels and the local journalists, particularly, I have a real concern and care for the local journalists, and I know you do too, Steve. They have a responsibility, I think, to back off of the commentary. Now, in this particular incident we're talking about in Minneapolis, I didn't see a lot on CNN. I saw reporting, and the experts that were brought in, at least in the initial hours, were former law enforcement types who could speak to the situation, what should happen next, what will happen next in terms of the investigation. They were not jumping to blame. They were not jumping to conclusions. They were simply speaking as authorities. Frankly, I didn't see what they did the next 2 days, the next 3 days, and I didn't watch any of the opinion shows because I have a feeling it was moving on from journalism. So when I say quell the commentary, I would love it if reporters would just be reporters, and in many cases in local TV stations, they are. I'd like anchors to be just telling us what it is, even if they're recycling the same facts. Once you jump from this to let's start pointing fingers, let's start getting into conclusions, then I think you're just following the social media crowd rather than leading. I would like the traditional media to lead, because social media is always going to do what it does. But I don't think traditional media distinguishes itself if it just follows the noise on social media and tells us what people are saying there, or jumps in and becomes a part of it. If they're going to succeed, if they're going to survive, if they're going to distinguish themselves, even with a smaller audience than they had 20 years ago, I think it's only going to come through getting back to journalism. So that's point one. I'll make the others tighter.
All right. Well, I've got about 3 minutes left here, so let me see how we can do this. And I'm going to try to maybe consolidate the 3 of them and see how we can summarize these. To politicians, you say, shut up and let the investigation proceed. And some of that you've just said. Social media, grown-ups, be grown-ups. And then number 4, breathe and turn it off. Now, yes. How realistic is it that we're going to see the blame game stop? Because it seems like every time that one of these things happen and it plays into the hands of people on both sides of the political aisle, it just erupts on social media more than anywhere else, particularly with a lot of people who don't have all the facts, and that is including politicians.
Is your life made better, and is the dialogue made better by constantly living in the comments, living on the commentary media? I don't need to name them, but there are some that are pretty much, they're just an argument. And that's it. That's all what drives them. Is your life any better, and is the public dialogue any better because of that? I've been convicted in my own attitude as a former journalist and as a person who cares about these things. There's nothing good to be gained from me living there. Do I check in? Sure. I want to see what people are saying, but it is so toxic. It is so misinformed in many cases and is so ideologically driven that I just don't think there's any common good that can come from that anymore. It is hard to do that, and if those people want to subscribe to turn it off, they'll find that I document my own journey with that, which in my case is not just an intellectual journey, it's a spiritual journey. I think it's a matter of Christian conviction for me to back off the time that I spend on these things so I can give time to other meaningful things in my life. But hear me out. I am not saying stop watching the news. I am saying look at what you're consuming and make sure you are getting a balanced perspective, but also living more with facts than commentary.
Randall King on Substack, and it's called Turn It Off. And
Turnitoffnow.substack.com.
There you go.
That's the URL.
And we'll put that right down at the bottom of the screen.
There we go. Yeah, you got to get the plug right.
Randall, thanks so much. We've always enjoyed visiting with you, and I hope you'll be with us again on News Classroom.
Look forward to it.
Coming up next, we take a look at what happens when tragedy not only is part of the news, but it has a personal impact on a newsroom. That's next, as News Classroom continues.
We begin with some very tragic news that's very personal to all of us here at WBRC. We confirmed our beloved reporter and coworker, Christina Chambers, was one of 2 people found dead in Hoover this morning.
Many of you watched Christina.
She started here in 2015, covering sports across Alabama and the country. She was a pivotal part of our sports team and a beloved member of our team. You saw her every Friday night on sideline. She was a dedicated runner. You saw her run and cover the Mercedes Marathon.
Rick Carl is a veteran journalist who not only knew Christina, he worked with her, and this was a situation that nobody could have possibly expected. Rick, I appreciate you coming on to talk about what is a very difficult subject, but particularly for a newsroom to have to deal with a tragedy that it's one of their own, and particularly one that is a police-involved violent situation. Just to begin this, how did that affect the people who had worked with Christina?
Yeah, it was a very difficult situation. Thanks for having me, by the way. And I apologize. I'm getting over the flu, so I'm horsey. So if you want to put up with me. But it was just a devastating situation. She worked at WBRC Fox 6 in Birmingham for many years. She came in as a sports reporter under me, who was a sports director. I think she started like in 2016, 17, that era. And she had just a great motor. The life of the party, and I mean that she's not a party. She's a hard worker, a workhorse. Would pick up the camera, would do anything she had to, and she did it all with zest and with vigor and with just a pure life and positivity. And when she passed, it just devastated so many people around her. The church, the Catholic Church up in Coleman, Alabama, where our family went, where she attended years ago, was, or 4 years rather, was jam-packed. Stories about her life permeated that church, and it was very, very a tough deal. But as far as the newsroom is concerned, well, I left that newsroom a couple years ago. I'm semi-retired now. I'm still good friends with mostly everybody at Channel 6, and they were just devastated. Being young, being beautiful, being upbeat, and like you said, the way it went down with a reported murder-suicide just made it all the more heartbreaking. But, you talk about how something like that can just devastate a newsroom. It can also really bring a newsroom together. And I mean, it brings you back to the big picture. I'm probably answering your second question here, but it brought people together in that, people that may not have gotten along all the time with the newsroom, as the news business is very competitive and it can be very snipey and at times. but it just brought people together and reminded us that, that there's a bigger story here, and there's a bigger message here that, people that work, whether it's a bank or real estate or a garbage disposal company or a newsroom, can get along. And, I think that a tragedy like that can actually, as strange as it sounds, though, can really kind of help a newsroom come together. You never want it to happen, of course. But I think in the long run, WBRC TV and all those she worked with are certainly blessed to have had her in their lives, for sure.
Rick, I watched the 4 o'clock news on the day the news broke about the murder-suicide, and obviously the investigation was just starting. And I watched the two young women who co-anchor the 4 o'clock news there at WBRC. And you could tell in their voices and their facial expressions, they were on the edge of tears. It was just such an emotional thing to have to deliver that to the public. And what goes through people's minds when you are facing having to deliver news about someone that was a dear friend of yours?
That's a tough one. I was a sports anchor for 39 years, I think it was. Gets away from me. I'm going to go back to 1980. But the last 4 years of my TV career, before I stepped aside about a year ago, I was a news anchor. I was a morning anchor at the NBC affiliate. So I did like 39, 40 years as a sports guy, which was all pretty much fun and games, right? And then 4 years of news anchoring. And I always had trouble reading stories about, the crimes and the death and the homicides and the fires. And, I'm more of a good news guy. That's what I am on Facebook, Rick Carly, Good News, So I struggled with that. But then when you bring that home, to someone you love and someone I don't know how you do it. I don't think I could have done it. And hats off to those at WBRC Channel 6 who got through that.
Rick Carly, Good News and veteran journalist from Birmingham. Thanks so much for being with us.
Have a great week.
We want to remind people that you can send us questions or observations. TV6newsclassroom@gmail.com. That is TV6, the number 6, TV6 News with the S, classroom@gmail.com.
Well, Steve, I hear the bell ringing, and that means we better wind it up because it's time to dismiss the class. So until next time, I'm Steve Beverly.
And I'm Steve Bowers. Be sure to join us next time for more of the News Classroom.